5 specialists left through the same door they'd entered 11 months ago. Julian Vane stood in the foyer and watched them go. Each one shook his hand on the way out, a specific pressure not too firm, the calibrated grip of men who deliver the same result repeatedly and have learned that how you say nothing matters. The last one, a developmental psychologist from Johns Hopkins, held Julian's hand a half-second longer than the others and said, "We'll revisit in 60 days. Julian nodded. He did not ask what revisiting would change. He stood there after the door closed. The foyer was 40 feet of white stone floor and a staircase that belonged in an architecture magazine. Julian had chosen this house for the view the Atlantic visible from almost every room, a horizon line so clean it was almost clinical. Right now, he wasn't looking at any of it. His hand was still at his side in the shape the last handshake had left it. Down the hallway in a room that contained more square footage than most Boston apartments, his son Leo sat in a wheelchair by the window. 5 years old. He was holding a small wooden ship against his chest with both hands, pine hull worn to the color of old, bone a crack along the port bow sealed with what looked like carpenter's glue from a previous repair. Every other toy in the room was untouched. Shelves of them arranged by Julian's household manager into color-grouped rows, red blocks, yellow trucks, a remote control helicopter still in its box. Leo had not reached for any of them since the week they arrived. The ship was the only object in the room that showed any evidence of use. Leo had not walked in 3 years, not since the night his mother's car went off Route 9 in the rain. Julian went to his study and stood at the window for a while before picking up his phone. He pulled up a contact that had been in his messages for 2 weeks, forwarded by a colleague in Millhaven, a coastal town 40 minutes south, with a 3-sentence note. She repairs old things for a living. She's good at reading what went wrong. No one else has helped. The contact was a woman named Clara Vance. She restored antique furniture and toys. Julian had looked at her name twice before and put the phone away. He called. Clara Vance arrived the next morning in a truck that had lived a long life. Bungee cord on the tailgate, a crack in the windshield sealed with a strip of clear packing tape. She pulled through the security gate after a 2-minute radio hold and parked in the circular drive without apparent concern for the fact that the gravel alone had cost more than her workshop rent for a year. She was 34, with a small chisel scar along her right thumb, and the kind of hands that stay steady when the rest of the body is under pressure. She wore work jeans and a canvas jacket. She carried a tool case that had been repaired at the hinge with a bolt and 2 washers. Julian's household manager, Margaret, met her at the main entrance. She looked Clara over the jacket, the boots, the case, and directed her toward the service wing door at the side of the house. Her tone was pleasant. Her body was already angled away. Clara adjusted the case on her shoulder and started walking the indicated direction. Julian came down the side corridor. He'd been watching on the entrance camera from his study. He caught Clara before she reached the service door and brought her back around to the front entrance, without explanation, walking 2 steps ahead of her through the main foyer, already thinking about the 11 o'clock call. He led her to Leo's room and stood in the doorway. Leo was in the same position he was every morning by the window ship against his chest, watching the Atlantic. He didn't look at Clara when she came in. Clara set her tool case on the floor about 6 feet from Leo's wheelchair. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't use the gentle lowered voice Julian had heard from 11 months of professionals. She opened the case, laid out her instruments, a thin pry blade, 2 soft picks, a horsehair brush, and began working the ship's hull with her eyes, speaking in a low, practical murmur about the joinery at the prow and what the grain pattern suggested about the wood's regional origin. She addressed the ship directly, not the boy holding it. The ship. Julian watched from the doorway. He was forming a sentence, something professional, something that managed expectations when Leo moved. Not dramatically. A half-inch forward in the wheelchair, a fractional lean, barely registerable. But Leo's gaze, which had been on the water outside, had shifted. It was on Clara's hands now. Julian closed his mouth. He stayed in the doorway another 30 seconds. Then he stepped back into the hallway, put his phone to his ear, and called Dr. Mercer's office. When Mercer came on the line, Julian said, "She's already with him. He moved." He listened to the response, his thumb pressed flat against the back of the phone. By the second morning, Leo's wheelchair was 3 feet closer to where Clara worked. He'd done it overnight. Nobody had seen him move it. Julian had checked the hallway camera at midnight and the room camera at 6, and both times, Leo was in the chair stationary. Somewhere between midnight and 6, the chair had crossed 3 feet of floor, and the only explanation was Leo. Clara noticed when she came in. She didn't react. She set her case down, opened it, and picked up where she'd left off. She had the ship fully disassembled, now hull open, deck panel loose, the inner keel exposed for inspection. The previous day, she'd noted that the deck panel was sealed with carpenter's wax along all 4 edges, not weathered shut, sealed deliberately and recently enough that the wax still compressed slightly under pressure. She'd made a note and moved on. Today, she removed the panel entirely and checked the cavity below it. Leo was 3 feet closer and watching her without pretense. Dr. Richard Mercer arrived at 11, 2 hours ahead of his scheduled consultation. He was 61, with the composed authority of a man who had never in 4 decades of practice been the second smartest person in any room he entered. His Boston practice served a client list that read like a donor wall at a university hospital. His visiting appointment at Children's General had been renewed 4 times. When Julian's legal team was building the treatment team 11 months ago, Mercer's name came first on every list they gave him. He stood outside Leo's room and looked through the glass for a full minute. He watched Clara's position on the floor. He watched Leo's shoulder alignment the reduced gap between the chair and her tools. He didn't go in. He found Julian in the study and took the chair across the desk. "I want to walk you through the liability structure," Mercer said, "because I don't think your team has flagged all of it." He set his briefcase on the armrest and produced a single sheet. No letterhead, a personal memo. He set it on the desk and waited for Julian to look at it. "She has no clinical standing. Any adverse event while she's the active presence in Leo's environment. A panic response. A regression. Any trauma escalation, and the exposure is yours personally. Not a licensed practitioner's malpractice coverage. Yours." "She's fixing a toy," Julian said. "She's in daily, unsupervised contact with a minor under a formal psychogenic diagnosis. That distinction doesn't hold in a court filing." Mercer picked up the briefcase. "I can call her this afternoon. Scheduling conflict clean, no friction." Julian looked at the sheet. "I'll think about it." Mercer nodded once and stood, lifted the memo off the desk and pocketed it. He left without the memo being discussed further, which was the point. Back in Leo's room, Clara had reached the inner hull compartment, the sealed cavity below the deck panel. She worked the wax seal with the thin blade, clearing it slowly along each edge so the wood wouldn't lift. The panel came free. She set it on the cloth beside her and looked into the cavity. There was something inside, a folded piece of paper, held against the interior wall by a small bead of the same carpenter's wax that had sealed the panel above. It not dropped in by accident, fixed there on purpose by someone who knew the cavity existed and knew how to close it again. Clara lifted it out, unfolded it, read the first 2 lines. Her hands went still on her knees. She read to the end. Then she refolded it along its original creases, careful as a lens, and pressed it into her jacket pocket. She picked up her horsehair brush and went back to work on the keel. 5 minutes later, she looked up and found Leo's hands empty and open on the wheelchair arms. The ship sat on the floor in front of him. He'd put it down without anyone asking. He was watching the open hull the way you watch something that has just told you part of its story. She read the note in her truck at the bottom of the cliff road with the engine off. It was written on the back of a restoration request form, the kind of standard printed sheet that antique dealers send with items for repair. Elena Vane had turned it over and used the blank side. The script was tight and forward-leaning, the pen pressed hard, the letters slightly compressed on the right margin where she'd been running out of room and kept writing, anyway. The date at the top was 14 days before the accident. She had written about the ship, who made it a furniture craftsman outside Portland, Maine, a friend of her father's, how it had come to be Leo's, the history of the ritual every Sunday evening. She placed the ship at the far end of the upstairs hallway, and Leo crawled to it, not walked. Crawled. He'd first reached for it as an infant before he could stand, and the body's memory of that motion had stayed in him even after he'd learned to walk. Elena had never redirected it. "Some things don't need correcting," she wrote. Then the lullaby. 4 bars of music notation in the lower third of the page, a minor key phrase slow, with a particular dip between the second and third bars that made the melody feel like a question gathering itself before the answer. She'd written the words underneath each phrase in her same compressed hand. Below the last note, she had underlined a single sentence twice. He only feels safe when the ship is sailing towards something. Clara sat with the note until the cab windows had fogged completely. Then she drove back to her workshop, laid it flat under the bench lamp, and worked through the melody bar by bar until her voice found the intervals without having to count them. The next morning, she arrived before Julian had finished his first call. She caught him in the kitchen doorway with his phone in one hand and his coffee in the other and asked, "What's the ship's name?" He looked at her. "I don't know. Does it have one?" "Most do." She picked up her case. "Ask Leo when you get a chance." Julian followed her upstairs. He stopped at Leo's doorway, his default position suit jacket on, phone still in hand, and said his son's name. Leo's eyes didn't move from the floor. "What's the ship called?" A long silence, the kind that makes adults shift their weight. Then quietly, in a voice that hadn't been used for much, "Elena." Julian's hand found the doorframe. His fingers closed on the molding once and released it. He turned without a word and walked down the hallway. His footsteps stopped somewhere before the stairs. Clara heard them stop and stay stopped. She didn't go after him. She spent the rest of the morning with Leo in the room, working narrating, leaving the silence where it fell. When she left at 4 o'clock, she stopped at Julian's study. The door was open. He was at his desk staring at something on the surface. She set Elena's note face down in the center of the desk and walked out. At 7 that evening, Mercer arrived unannounced. When Julian let him in, the note was in Julian's hand. Mercer looked at it, but didn't ask what it was. They talked for 40 minutes in the study with the door closed. When Mercer left, he went straight to his car and was on the phone before he reached the bottom of the drive. The legal memo arrived Monday at 9:15, 4 pages. Subject risk assessment, unlicensed third-party involvement, minor ward Vane residence. Julian's legal team had built it on Mercer's framework and translated it into the language of indemnification schedules. Page 3 held the sentence that mattered: the pending acquisition of Atlantic Grid Holdings $2. $4 billion, close date in 22 days, required Julian's personal, legal, and reputational profile to remain clean. 2 board members had already submitted formal inquiries. The memo recommended immediate termination of Clara Vance's arrangement. A draft letter was attached. Julian printed the letter, read it, set it on the right side of his desk face up. Then he went upstairs. Leo was talking. Short sentences, 3 words, 4 words at most, always directed at Clara, always about the ship, whether the brass fittings were original, what paint she was using on the hull. 3 questions in 17 days, each one the kind of exchange Julian's neuropsychologist had been trying to produce for 9 months through structured language response drills. Julian stood in the doorway and listened to Leo ask a 4th question and said nothing and watched. What he was actually watching wasn't Leo's mouth. It was Leo's eyes. In the 10 minutes Julian stood there, Leo's gaze moved continuously to the window, to Clara's hands, to the workbench, to the wall above. But not once did it go below his own chest. Not once. A hand laid flat on the knee, a boot on the wheelchair footrest. Leo's eyes tracked everything in the room, except the lower half of his own body. Julian had watched 12 clinical assessments in that room over 11 months. Nobody had flagged this. He looked at what Leo's eyes went back to most often: the wall opposite the window. 3 oil paintings hung high, Elena's coastal landscapes from years before Leo was born. The boy's gaze returned to them the way a person returns to a face they trust. Julian took 2 steps through the door. He still had his phone. He was still in the suit he'd worn to the 8 o'clock call. Leo's shoulders rose toward his ears. It wasn't a flinch. It was slower than that, a contraction, a drawing inward, the body making itself smaller without the brain having issued the instruction. His chin came down 1/2 inch, both forearms pressed against the armrests of the wheelchair. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the floor directly below the ship and waited. Julian stepped back to the doorway. Leo's shoulders dropped. Julian stood in the doorway for another full minute and didn't move and didn't speak. Clara's pen moved in the notebook beside her case. She still hadn't looked up. He went back to his study. The termination letter was on the right side of the desk where he'd left it. He looked at it, went to his 2:00 call, came back. It was still there. He left it there the next day, and the next. On the third morning, he called Clara to the study and sat behind the desk without touching the letter. "What's in the notebook?" he said. Clara sat down, put the notebook on the desk beside the termination letter, and opened it to the first page. "He doesn't look at his legs," she said. Julian glanced at the notebook. 14 days. Not once. She turned the notebook toward him. The pages were in the same format she used on every restoration job dates. Observations, physical descriptions, nothing clinical. Just what she'd seen written plainly. "Every specialist you've had in here was measuring output, what he can and can't do. I was watching what he avoids." Julian pulled the notebook toward him and read. Clara waited. "Then, when you come in wearing the suit the phone his chest pulls in, every time. He doesn't breathe right again until you're back in the doorway." Julian kept reading. "His legs work," Clara said. "The scans told you that 3 years ago, so it's not a physical failure." She reached over and turned to the last page of the notebook. One sentence circled twice. "He doesn't believe there is somewhere worth walking to." That's not a neurological diagnosis. That's a kid who stopped in a specific moment and hasn't found a reason to leave it. She stopped. Started again. "When I take apart something, old furniture, a musical instrument, whatever, I look at the damage pattern. The wear tells you where the pressure was. Not where the crack is, where the pressure came from." She was looking at her own hands now. "Leo's been showing everyone where the crack is. Nobody asked about the pressure." Julian set the notebook down. "Did any of Mercer's people ever ask Leo what the ship's name was?" The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "They treated a diagnosis," Clara said. "Not a kid." Julian looked at the termination letter for a moment. Then he picked it up by one corner, tore it in half lengthwise, and dropped both pieces in the recycling bin beside the desk. No ceremony. He set the notebook on the edge of the desk back toward her. "If you've ever been told you weren't qualified to help someone you knew you could reach, drop a 1 in the comments right now. I see every single one of you." Clara took the notebook, stood. "Clara." She stopped at the door. The melody, in Elena's note. Julian's eyes were on the window. "You've got it. Yeah. Keep it ready." He picked up his phone and went back to his screen. That evening, his assistant sent a cancellation notice to Mercer's office for the following week. No reschedule. At 9:40 p.m., Julian's private line rang. The number belonged to a board member named Harold Fitch, who had called Julian twice in the past month about the merger timeline. Julian let it go to voicemail. Mercer had gone around him. The question now was how far around. This is a work of fiction. All characters' organizations and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. Viewer advisory. The story includes themes of child illness grief, class discrimination, and institutional injustice, and some scenes may be emotionally intense. The nor'easter came in an hour ahead of the forecast. By 4 o'clock on Thursday, the glass was running white, and the sea below the cliff had gone from gray-green to iron. The sound was the thing. Rain on the 40-foot windows of the Oak Haven mansion produced a specific, irregular percussion heavy, uneven with a low resonance that got into the walls. The power went at 4:30. Transformer on the coastal grid. The heating died with it. The staff brought candles. The house went dim and cold in the particular way of large rooms that were never warm to begin with. Clara had been in Leo's room when the lights cut. The dark wasn't the problem. The sound was. Leo's breathing changed in the first 30 seconds. It thinned, went short, and clipped the chest barely moving. His eyes went wide and fixed not on Clara, not on the window, not on anything in the room. His hands gripped the ship tighter. He made no sound. He just went somewhere else behind his eyes, back to a night 3 years ago, when rain on glass had sounded like this, and the phone had rung, and his whole world had come apart in the dark. Julian came through the door, moving fast. Both arms were already positioned, the practice motion of a man who had carried his son out of panic situations before reaching for Leo to lift him toward the staircase, toward the interior safe room on the lower level, with its generator heat and its sealed windows. Clara's hand landed on his forearm. One hand. Light pressure. He stopped. His eyes went to her face, and everything in his expression went to the edge of something, the particular stillness of a man who is frightened for his child and has just had his first instinct physically interrupted. 2 minutes, Clara said. His jaw set, but he didn't move. Clara crossed to the workbench. She picked up the Elena Finish Now, hull sealed, paint dry, name lettered on the stern, and set it on the floor in the center of the room, exactly 6 feet from Leo's chair. Then she sat down beside it on the floor, cross-legged, her hand flat on the ship's side. And she hummed 4 bars. The melody from the note. She had the intervals right, the dip between the second and third bars, the place where the phrase holds before it resolves, the note that makes the child's body recognize before the mind does. She kept her voice low. The rain kept going against the glass. Behind her, Julian's breath came out through his nose. He'd last heard that melody 3 years ago from the person it belonged to in this same house. His hand found the wall beside the door and stayed there. In the wheelchair, Leo's chest slowed. "She needs a captain," Clara said. Her hand didn't move from the ship's side. The Elena. Heavy water, no one at the helm. "Your mom painted a captain standing right here, remember?" Leo's eyes went down. For the first time since the accident, his gaze dropped all the way to his own legs. He looked at his knees, his feet on the footrests, his hands gripping the ship. He looked at the floor. He pressed his palms flat on the wheelchair seat. What happened next took a long time and wasn't pretty. His arms shook. His face went tight with an effort that was entirely silent. He pitched forward off the seat and caught himself on both hands on the floor, and his legs, which had not, bent under load in 3 years, bent. Slowly, with resistance. He didn't stand. He crawled, hands and knees crossing the floor toward the ship, covering the 6 feet with the focused, graceless determination of a body, relearning something it had decided was over. When both hands touched the hull, he stopped. He looked up, at his father. Direct, unclouded, no contraction. Just Leo, 5 years old, out of breath, hands on his mother's ship, looking at the one other person in the world who had loved her. "Dad," his voice was steady, "help me stand up so I can steer." Julian crossed the room and went to his knees on the floor beside his son. He didn't say anything. He put both arms around Leo and held him. Leo's hands stayed on the ship's hull. Clara faced the workbench. She picked up a tool and held it and looked at the wall. The storm continued. Inside the room, no one moved for a long time. When the power came back at 6, Julian was still on the floor. Leo was asleep against his chest, the Elena in the crook of his arm. The next morning, Julian called Mercer's office and left a voicemail. 30 seconds. The last sentence. "The terms of our arrangement are changing." He hung up. He didn't wait for a call back. Mercer listened to the message twice sitting in his car in the children's general parking structure. Then he made 3 phone calls in 9 minutes. The filing went in on a Friday. Mercer submitted it to the Massachusetts Office of Child and Family Services as a professional inquiry, technically not a complaint, structurally indistinguishable from one. The paperwork identified Clara Vance by name. It cited her lack of clinical licensure. It described ongoing, unsupervised contact with a psychologically diagnosed minor. It used the phrase ongoing, unsupervised contact 4 times across 2 pages. It did not mention Leo's name when he'd first spoken in 3 years. It did not mention the storm. It did not mention the 6 feet of floor he'd crossed on his hands and knees to reach his mother's ship. A file was created. The file produced a case number. The case number in the right hands looked exactly like what Mercer needed it to look like. He followed up with 2 Atlantic Grid board members, the same ones who'd already raised concerns, and described the state filing in terms of press exposure risk. An unlicensed individual in a documented therapeutic role with a vulnerable minor. A formal case number on record. 3 weeks from merger close. He didn't need to finish the sentence for them. A joint memo arrived at Julian's office Monday. Polite, unambiguous. Julian read it, turned it over, and went back to his screen. Clara found out through a child welfare advocate in Mill Haven, a woman named Rosa, who ran a community legal aid office and who recognized Clara's name in the filing and called her the same afternoon. Clara listened without interrupting. She thanked Rosa and ended the call. She stood at her workbench with both hands on the edge of it and looked at the wall above her tools. Then she sat down and opened her laptop. Dr. Anaya Reeves, Department Head, Grief-Induced Somatic Disorder Research, Boston Children's Hospital. Clara had met her 3 years earlier before the Mill Haven workshop, during a 2-year stint with a coastal arts outreach program for children with developmental and grief-related challenges. Clara had facilitated workshops, tactile restoration work, rebuilding broken objects with children who had trouble with language. Reeves had observed 2 sessions, asked careful questions afterward, and said before she left, "What you're doing has a name in the literature. It just doesn't have your version of it yet." Clara typed a detailed message. Leo's gaze patterns. The body lock response to Julian's posture. The ship ritual. The storm. She attached a scanned copy of Elena's note with the identifying details blacked out. She asked for a professional opinion. The reply came in 40 minutes. 3 words. "This is textbook." Clara called her. They talked for 50 minutes. Reeves offered a formal written assessment, a letter of support for the state inquiry, and a personal appearance if it became necessary. "Where is this?" she asked. "Oak Haven. 40 minutes from you." Clara looked out at the harbor. "There's a public event in 2 weeks. A gala. I don't know yet if it becomes the place." "If it does," Reeves said, "call me the night before. I'll come up." Clara hung up and sat for a moment. Then she went to the drying rack and checked the Elena Hull lacquered fittings polished, name lettered cleanly on the stern. It was ready. Had been ready for 2 days. She brought it inside and set it on the shelf above her bench under the lamp. "This is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. Viewer advisory. The story includes themes of child illness, grief, class discrimination, and institutional injustice, and some scenes may be emotionally intense. The Oak Haven Coastal Arts Center had been a shipping warehouse in a previous life. The conversion had kept the exposed ceiling joists and the original slope of the floor toward the harbor end, a tilt so slight you only noticed it when a glass shifted on an unattended table. On the first Saturday in November, it was filled with the kind of light that comes from candles and warm tungsten and the noise of 200 conversations running at a careful half volume. Regional philanthropists. Board members from 3 foundations. 2 reporters and a photographer. The mayor's chief of staff. People who moved money by deciding which rooms to enter. Mercer arrived 45 minutes before the program. He had done this before the pre-event circuit, the careful placement of a narrative before anyone stood at a podium. A word here about clinical rigor, a quiet aside there about evidence-based frameworks. He moved through the room with unhurried purpose. And by 7 o'clock, the conversation about tonight's announcement had been shaped in the direction he needed it to go. Nobody in that room had heard the name Clara Vance. Clara arrived at 7:15 in a dark blue dress she'd borrowed from her neighbor Janet. No nameplate at any table. She found a position near the back wall beside a window that looked over the dark harbor and stood there with a glass of water. Julian arrived at 7:20 alone. He spoke briefly with the event coordinator, checked his watch, and took a position at the side of the stage. He'd sent a staff member ahead with Leo in a separate car, a longer, smoother route, better suited to Leo's pace, with instructions to bring him to the side entrance and wait. He'd sent the text 20 minutes ago. He hadn't told anyone what the text was for. The program opened at 7:30. The event coordinator spoke for 4 minutes, then introduced Mercer to provide context for the evening's announcement. Mercer adjusted the microphone and took a moment to look at the room. The room he'd been arranging for the past 45 minutes. "What we have been privileged to witness," he said, "is a demonstration of what evidence-based clinical practice produces over time. Patience, precision, a long-term neurological engagement protocol built on established psychogenic frameworks." He let the room breathe. One of the significant risks in cases like Leo's is well-intentioned lay involvement reaching for warmth when the patient requires structure. Managing that risk has been central to the work. A few heads in the third and fourth rows moved in the affirmative. He'd put them there. Tonight's initiative is built on exactly that discipline. Solid applause. Pre-formed collective satisfied with itself. Mercer extended his hand toward Julian, an invitation to the podium. A gesture that shared the credit without surrendering the narrative. Julian's jacket pocket buzzed once. He'd sent the second text 4 minutes ago when Mercer had started speaking. The side door opened. Leo walked in. Navy coat, both arms around the Elena. His left foot landing slightly wide on each step, the residual hesitation his therapist said would likely resolve by spring. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the back wall, at the dark blue dress beside the window. He was walking across the Oak Haven Coastal Arts Center on his own 2 feet. The woman in the third row, Patricia Crane, board member of the Oak Haven Children's Foundation, reached out and touched her husband's sleeve without knowing she was doing it. He turned. The couple immediately behind them registered the stillness in the row in front and turned as well. A reporter near the side wall lowered his pen. A woman near the bar set her glass down slowly, the way people set things down when they don't want to make noise. The applause stopped. 200 people went quiet and watched a 5-year-old cross a room. Leo is crossing that floor on his own. Every specialist said this couldn't happen. If you have ever watched someone walk straight through every wall that was built around them, tell me in the comments. Because what Julian does next is something this room is never going to forget. Mercer heard the quiet half a second before he understood it. He turned. His composure held 4 decades of it built for exactly this kind of pressure. But his eyes did something involuntary. They went to Julian first, not to Leo. A calculation fast and visible only to someone watching for it. Julian's expression gave him nothing. Mercer stepped back from the podium. Julian walked to the microphone. At the back of the room, Leo had reached Clara. She'd come 3 steps forward from the wall, and he'd closed the remaining distance and stopped in front of her and held the Elena out. Both hands. The way you offer something to someone you've decided to trust with it. She took it. Her other hand rested briefly on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Julian watched from the podium. He took out Elena's note from his breast pocket, the folded paper Clara had left on his desk 6 weeks ago, and held it at his side. He didn't unfold it. He didn't perform it. He just held it. "I had remarks prepared," he said. "I'm not going to use them." The room, still quiet from Leo's entrance, got quieter. "My son walked into this room tonight because of a woman who repairs old wooden toys in a town 40 minutes south of here. Her name is Clara Vance. She doesn't have a clinical degree. She isn't affiliated with any institution. Her name doesn't appear in any of the protocols built around Leo over the past 11 months. Julian's voice was level, not loud. What she has is the ability to look at something broken and find where the damage actually started. She opened the hull of a ship my son has been holding for 3 years and found a piece of paper that had been sealed inside it. His mother put it there 2 weeks before she died." He lifted the note slightly. It contained a lullaby and 1 sentence. He unfolded the note. "Read aloud. He only feels safe when the ship is sailing towards something." Nothing moved in the room. "I also want to name Dr. Anaya Reeves of Boston Children's Hospital, who reviewed Clara's methodology and confirmed its alignment with established somatic grief treatment frameworks. Her written assessment is on formal record as of this week." Julian folded the note and placed it on the podium. "The initiative I was going to announce tonight has been redesigned. It will not be institutional. Art therapy-based, community-funded, built in the coastal town where Clara works. The Oak Haven Children's Art Therapy Center. Opening in 4 months. Clara Vance, Executive Director." Mercer moved from the side of the stage, 1 step toward the podium arms starting to lift. Julian looked at him. It was a brief look without heat. It did not shift. Mercer's arm came back down. He stayed where he was. "I built my son a fortress," Julian said. "I thought that was what protection looked like. Everything controlled, everything managed. I was wrong about most of it." He looked toward the back of the room, at Leo standing beside Clara with his hands free and his feet on the floor. He didn't need a better fortress. He needed someone to open the gate. Patricia Crane stood up. She didn't look around to see if anyone else was going to. She just stood. Her husband rose beside her a second later. In the row behind them, a man in his 60s who'd spent the last 40 minutes nodding at Mercer's setup got to his feet not quickly, but without hesitation. The woman beside him followed. The applause built from the third row forward and found the back of the room last, where Clara was standing with one hand on Leo's shoulder and the ship in the other arm, and where it arrived with the particular weight of something that had been a long time coming. Mercer stood at the side of the stage through 40 seconds of it. His composure held, and then it settled, a distinction that anyone who'd watched him work would recognize. Not a break, a settling. The expression of a man who has understood that the architecture he spent 3 months building is finished, and what finishes it isn't anger or shock. It's simply being seen clearly for the first time. His gaze crossed the room to Clara. She met it for a moment. Then she looked down at Leo. He left while the applause was still running. In the lobby, 30 minutes later, Julian's attorney spoke to the 2 reporters present. Doctor, Mercer's consulting contract would not be renewed. The state inquiry filed against Clara Vance was being formally withdrawn. The family had submitted a detailed written account to the reviewing office that afternoon. The Oak Haven Children's Art Therapy Center had secured a converted boathouse on the Millhaven Harbor. Target opening April. One of the reporters asked who had first referred Clara to the case. Julian's attorney smiled. A 5-year-old, he said. 6 months. Leo's physical therapist was a woman named Dara, who drove up from Millhaven 3 mornings a week and had learned by the second session to set the Elena at the end of the hallway. Leo walked to it every time. His left foot still landed slightly wide. The doctor said it would likely resolve completely over the year. This did not particularly preoccupy Leo. He walked to the ship and he walked back, and over the months, the distance between resolved and not resolved narrowed in a way that no one needed to measure. The Oak Haven Children's Art Therapy Center opened in the converted boathouse on the Millhaven Harbor on the 1st of April. The building smelled of salt air and linseed oil, and the particular combination of sawdust and fresh paint. That means things are being made. The walls held children's work the way things get hung when they're actually being used, overlapping, some of it crooked, a few pieces falling off their pins and repinned with extra tape. Low tables, small stools, open shelves of materials. Nothing in the room that required a credential to touch. Clara was there before 8 every morning. Julian came 3 times a week. He didn't wear suits to the center. He wore the kind of clothes that collect the evidence of a room with children in it, scuff on the right, knee wood dust in the cuffs, a paint smear along the back of one wrist that he'd missed with the soap. He had been learning how to sit at a small table and wait for something to happen instead of making it happen. He was slow at this. He kept trying. In May, he walked the cliff path with Leo, a 1/4 mile of worn coastal stone above the Atlantic, the path demanding enough attention that you couldn't be anywhere else while you were on it. Leo set the pace. Julian matched it. He didn't reach for Leo's arm, didn't check the phone in his jacket pocket, didn't think about what needed to happen when they got back. He took each step at the speed Leo took it, and the cliff and the water and the late afternoon light were there for both of them the same way. In Leo's bedroom, the Elena sat on the windowsill in the morning light, hull smooth, name readable on the stern, the full restoration complete. On the underside, in letters small enough to require angling the ship toward a lamp, Clara had painted a line in the same hand she used on her restoration tags. A captain always knows where home is. Leo had found it 2 mornings after the gala. He'd carried the ship down to Julian's study and held it out without a word, just waited. Julian read it and put his arm around his son's shoulders, and they sat in the study for a while. The room was changing. It had been an office. It was becoming something else. That evening, Julian and Clara sat on the side porch steps. The back door, the one that faced the water, not the formal entrance with the harbor lights coming on in Millhaven below. Leo was asleep upstairs. The ocean moved in the dark at the bottom of the cliff, doing what it had done long before any of this and would keep doing after. "Could you tell what the original name was?" Julian asked, before Elena painted over it. "No," The layer underneath was too far gone. She looked out at the harbor lights. Doesn't matter. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you. 2 words. No speech around them. Clara nodded. Go check on your kid, she said. He went inside. Upstairs, a captain slept with his ship in the crook of his arm. One hand curved around the stern the way it always was, the way it had always been. And somewhere in the house, a gate that had been closed for 3 years was still open. Julian had every resource in the world and still couldn't find what mattered until a woman with a carving chisel opened a sealed hull and changed everything. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if this story found you at the right moment, send it to someone who needs it, because sometimes the right thing reaches us only because someone else passed it on. He didn't build his son a better fortress. He finally opened the gate.